They found the cowboy 3 days later, half dead and delirious. But his horse was still standing guard, refusing to let the buzzards near his body. What happened next will make you question everything you think you know about loyalty. The morning sun painted the Sonoran desert in shades of gold and amber as Mac Sullivan checked the fence line one last time before heading back to the main house. At 58, his weathered hands still moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent his entire life working with horses, but his back reminded him daily that those years were catching up fast. The Double Bar Ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of Arizona desert, a place where ancient saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels over vast expanses of creosote and palo verde. Mac had been the head wrangler here for 12 years now, ever since he'd come home from his final tour overseas and decided he'd had enough of cities, crowds, and complications. "You're getting too old for this, Mac," he muttered to himself, adjusting his worn Stetson against the climbing sun. But the truth was, he couldn't imagine doing anything else. This land, these horses, they were his therapy, his church, his reason for getting up each morning. The sound of hoofbeats made him turn toward the main corral, where Chester was pacing restlessly along the fence. The 15-year-old chestnut quarter horse had been Mac's special project for the past 8 months, ever since they'd found him half dead near an abandoned ranch 40 miles north. The previous owners had left him behind when they'd lost the property to foreclosure, with barely enough water to last a week. Chester had been a broken animal when Mac first laid eyes on him, malnourished, dehydrated, and carrying the kind of deep sadness in his eyes that Mac recognized all too well. It was the look of something that had lost everything and didn't expect kindness anymore. "Easy there, boy," Mac called out, approaching the corral with measured steps. Chester's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice, and the horse moved toward the fence with cautious hope. Mac had grown up on his grandfather's ranch outside Tucson, where horses weren't just livestock. They were family members, each with their own personality, their own story. His grandfather, old Samuel Sullivan, had taught him that you could tell everything about a man by how he treated his horses. "A horse won't lie to you, Marcus," the old man used to say, using Mac's given name the way only family could. "He won't pretend to trust you if you haven't earned it. And once you do earn it, he'll die for you if need be." Those words had carried Mac through 3 tours of duty, through the chaos of coming home to a world that didn't quite make sense anymore, and through the quiet years of rebuilding himself one fence post, one training session, one sunrise at a time. Chester had arrived at the Double Bar as part of a group rescue. 7 horses in various states of neglect, all of them needing medical attention, rehabilitation, and time. The ranch owner, Ellen Martinez, had a soft spot for abandoned animals and the resources to help them. She'd given Mac carte blanche to work with whatever animals spoke to him. Chester had spoken to him immediately. There was something in the horse's eyes, a kind of quiet dignity that reminded Mac of soldiers he'd known. Men who'd been through hell, but hadn't let it break their essential decency. Chester had been mistreated. That was clear from the old rope burns around his neck and the way he flinched at sudden movements. But he hadn't turned mean. He'd just turned careful. Trust has to be earned twice when it's been broken once. Mac had told Ellen during Chester's first week at the ranch. This one's going to take time. But Mac had time. After 26 years, in the Army, followed by a decade of drifting from job to job trying to find his place in civilian life, he'd finally found something that mattered. Not the grand, world-changing kind of purpose they talked about in motivational speeches, but the quiet, daily kind of purpose that built character, one small choice at a time. The rehabilitation had been slow, methodical work. First came trust. Hours, spent just sitting near Chester's stall, reading aloud from old Western novels, or talking about nothing in particular while the horse learned that human presence didn't always mean pain or demands. Then came touch, gentle grooming sessions where Mac's rough hands learned to be patient, and Chester's nervous system learned to accept kindness without expecting the catch. The breakthrough had come in the 4th month, during a particularly difficult afternoon when Mac had been struggling with his own demons. He'd been reading a letter from his sister back in Tucson, news about their father's declining health, when Chester had walked over to where Mac sat on a hay bale and simply rested his head on Mac's shoulder. It was such a small gesture, but it had nearly broken Mac open. Here was an animal that had every reason to mistrust humans, offering comfort to someone who was hurting. In that moment, Mac understood that Chester wasn't just being rehabilitated, they were healing each other. "You're one of the good ones, aren't you, boy?" Mac whispered now, running his hand along Chester's neck. The horse's coat had filled out beautifully over the months, his chestnut color rich and gleaming in the morning light. His muscles had regained their strength, and his eyes had lost that haunted look that came with abandonment. But more than his physical recovery, Chester had developed something that couldn't be taught or trained, a deep, intuitive connection with Mac that went beyond the usual relationship between horse and rider. Chester seemed to sense Mac's moods, his needs, sometimes even his intentions before Mac was fully aware of them himself. Ellen had noticed it too. "I've been around horses my whole life," she told Mac just last week, "and I've never seen anything quite like what you two have. It's like he's chosen you as much as you've chosen him." The other ranch hands had started calling Chester Mac's shadow, because of the way the horse would position himself wherever he could keep Mac in sight during the workday. If Mac was fixing fence in the north pasture, Chester would graze nearby. If Mac was working in the barn, Chester would find reasons to wander past the open doors. It should have been clingy, possessive behavior, but it never felt that way. Chester's attention felt more like partnership, like the quiet presence of a friend who didn't need conversation to offer support. Mac pulled a sugar cube from his shirt pocket, a ritual they'd developed over the months, and Chester took it, with the gentle precision that spoke of a well-mannered animal who'd been properly loved at some point in his past. Someone had taken the time to teach this horse manners, which made his abandonment all the more heartbreaking. "Ellen wants me to start working with that new mare this afternoon," Mac told Chester conversationally. "Gonna be gone for a few hours over at the south barn. You think you can handle that?" Chester's ears flicked forward and back, and he nickered softly, a sound Mac had learned to interpret as mild protest. The horse tolerated Mac's work with other animals, but he made his preferences clear. The truth was, Mac preferred working with Chester too. There was something about their sessions together that felt less like training and more like collaboration. Chester had an intelligence that went beyond typical horse behavior, an ability to anticipate and respond that made riding feel like a conversation between old friends. They'd been working on advanced maneuvers lately, cutting patterns, emergency stops, the kind of precise control that came in handy during roundups. But more than that, they'd been exploring the desert together, long rides through the vast landscape that surrounded the ranch. Those desert rides had become Mac's favorite part of each day. There was something about the silence out there, the endless sky and ancient rocks that put everything into perspective. The army had taught him to always be alert, always scanning for threats, but riding Chester through the desert, Mac had learned to simply be present. Chester seemed to love those rides as much as Mac did. The horse would prance and dance when he saw Mac approaching with the saddle, eager to head out into the open country. Once they were away from the ranch buildings, Chester would settle into ground-eating gaits that could cover miles without strain, his hooves finding sure footing on terrain that would challenge most horses. "Tomorrow's supposed to be clear," Mac said, giving Chester a final pat. "Maybe we'll head out towards Saddleback Ridge, check on that old mine shaft Ellen's been worried about." It was a routine they'd established, Mac talking through his plans while Chester listened with the focused attention that never failed to amaze him. Whether the horse actually understood the words or was simply responding to tone and emotion, Mac couldn't say. But Chester's responses always felt like genuine communication. The morning was getting warm, and Mac still had work to finish before the day got too hot. Summer in the Sonoran Desert was unforgiving, with temperatures that could kill the unprepared. Even experienced desert hands like Mac treated the heat with respect, planning their days around the sun's schedule. "All right, boy, I've got to get moving," Mac said. But he lingered for another moment, watching Chester return to his grazing. There were days when Mac felt like he could stand there forever, just observing the quiet contentment of a well-cared-for animal going about his business. It was such a simple thing, but after years of complexity and conflict, simple had become precious. As Mac walked back toward the main ranch buildings, he reflected on how much his life had changed since Chester's arrival. He'd always been competent with horses, but working with Chester had reminded him why he'd fallen in love with them in the first place. It wasn't about dominance or control. It was about partnership, about the unique relationship that could develop between two very different species when trust was mutual and respect was earned. His phone buzzed with a text from Ellen. "Can you take Chester out to check the east boundary fence this afternoon? Thought you two might enjoy the ride and I need eyes on that section before the weekend." Max smiled and typed back, "We'll head out after lunch." It was exactly the kind of work Mac loved best. Purposeful but peaceful. Necessary but not urgent. He and Chester could take their time, cover the ground thoroughly, maybe even explore some of the side canyons they'd been curious about. The east boundary was remote country, miles from the nearest road, accessible only on horseback or on foot. It was the kind of place where a man could think, where the modern world felt distant enough to ignore. Mac had done some of his best processing out there, working through memories and regrets while Chester carried him across ancient landscapes that had witnessed countless other stories of survival and renewal. As he reached the barn, Mac found himself looking forward to the afternoon ride, with the kind of anticipation he hadn't felt about much of anything in years. Chester had given him back something he'd thought was lost forever. The ability to find joy in simple things, to trust in relationships that didn't require words, to believe that some connections transcended explanation. He'd rescued Chester from abandonment and neglect, but increasingly Mac understood that the rescue had gone both ways. The horse had saved him too, from isolation, from cynicism, from the gradual hardening that could happen to a man's heart if he wasn't careful. "Getting soft in your old age, Sullivan," he muttered to himself. But he was smiling as he said it. Some kinds of softness were worth preserving. The afternoon had started like any other. Mac saddled Chester with the easy rhythm of 12 years' practice, checking the cinch twice out of habit more than necessity. Chester stood patient and alert, ears flicking toward the east boundary where they'd be heading, almost as if he understood their destination before Mac had even pointed him in that direction. "Easy day today, boy," Mac murmured, adjusting the stirrups and securing his water bottles to the saddle. "Just checking fence and enjoying the ride." The weather had been perfect when they'd set out at 2 o'clock. Clear skies, temperature in the comfortable 70s, light breeze from the southwest. Mac had packed for a routine patrol, fence repair tools, extra water, his satellite phone for emergencies, and a small first aid kit. Everything a responsible ranch hand carried into the desert. But the desert was a living thing, and like all living things, it could turn unpredictable without warning. They'd been riding for about an hour when Mac first noticed the change in the light. The sun, which had been burning bright and clear, suddenly seemed diffused, as if someone had drawn gauze across the sky. He pulled Chester to a stop and looked back toward the west, where a wall of brown was building on the horizon. "Well, hell," Mac said quietly. "A dust storm, and a big one by the looks of it." Dust storms in the Sonoran Desert weren't uncommon, especially during the summer months when powerful thunderstorms created massive downdrafts that could pick up tons of desert sand and carry it for miles. Mac had lived through plenty of them, but always from the safety of ranch buildings, or at least with solid shelter nearby. Out here, 15 miles from the nearest structure, with nothing but creosote bushes and scattered rocks for cover, a dust storm was a different kind of threat entirely. Chester sensed the change in Mac's tension and began to dance sideways, his nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Horses had better instincts for weather than most humans, and Chester's increasing agitation told Mac everything he needed to know about what was coming. "Easy, boy," Mac said, but his voice carried an edge now. He pulled out his satellite phone and checked the signal, 2 bars, enough to get through. He speed-dialed the ranch. "Double bar, this is Ellen." "Ellen, it's Mac. I'm about 12 miles out on the east boundary, and there's a hell of a dust storm coming in from the west. Looks like it's moving fast. There was a pause, and Mac could hear Ellen moving around, probably checking her own weather instruments. I'm seeing it on radar now, she said. Massive system, probably 60-mile-an-hour winds. Mac, you need to find shelter and hunker down. Don't try to outrun it. Copy that. Chester and I will find something and wait it out. Be careful, Mac. These storms can last hours and visibility drops to 0. Call me when you're secure. Mac ended the call and looked around at the landscape with new eyes. The east boundary ran through some of the most remote country on the ranch. Rolling hills cut by deep arroyos, scattered with boulders and the occasional overhanging rock formation. There had to be something that could provide shelter. Chester was getting more agitated by the minute, pawing at the ground and throwing his head up to stare at the approaching wall of dust. The storm was moving faster than Mac had initially thought. What had been a distant brown smudge 10 minutes ago was now a towering wall that stretched from horizon to horizon, blotting out everything in its path. Come on, boy. Let's find us a cave or something. Mac urged Chester into a lope, scanning the terrain ahead for anything that might offer protection. The wind was picking up now, carrying the first hints of dust and the electric smell that came before big weather. Behind them, the storm continued its relentless advance, a moving mountain of sand and debris that turned day into night wherever it passed. They crested a low ridge and Mac spotted what he was looking for. A cluster of large boulders about a mile ahead, stacked in a way that might provide a windbreak. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best option available. That's our spot, Chester. Let's move. But as they started down the ridge, Chester suddenly shied hard to the left, nearly unseating Mac. The horse spun in a complete circle, snorting and backing away from something Mac couldn't see. What is it, boy? What's wrong? Mac looked where Chester had been heading and saw it. A section of ground that looked solid but was actually a thin crust covering what appeared to be an old mine shaft or natural cave. The kind of hidden hazard that could swallow a horse and rider without warning. Good catch, Chester. Good boy. Chester's instincts had just saved both their lives. Mac guided the horse carefully around the concealed opening, making a mental note of its location. Ellen would want to know about this hazard, assuming they made it back to tell her about it. They reached the boulder cluster just as the leading edge of the storm hit. The wind went from a steady breeze to a howling fury in seconds, and the world disappeared in a wall of stinging sand and debris. Mac quickly dismounted and led Chester into the partial shelter formed by the largest rocks. There wasn't much, maybe 8 feet of breathing room between 2 house-sized boulders, but it was enough to break the worst of the wind. Mac tied Chester's reins to a sturdy piece of rock and then pressed himself against the horse's side, both of them seeking comfort in each other's presence as the storm raged around them. The noise was incredible, a constant roar punctuated by the sharp crack of debris hitting the rocks. Visibility dropped to less than 3 feet, and the air became so thick with dust that breathing required conscious effort. Mac pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, then did what he could to protect Chester's airways as well. Hours passed. The storm showed no signs of weakening, and Mac began to worry about their water supply. He'd brought enough for a normal patrol, but not for an extended survival situation. Chester would need more than Mac could spare, especially if they were trapped here overnight. It was around 6 o'clock when things went from bad to worse. Mac was checking on Chester when he heard the sound that every desert dweller dreaded. The deep rumble of moving water. Flash floods in the desert could appear without warning, born from thunderstorms dozens of miles away, turning dry arroyos into raging torrents in minutes. Oh no, Mac breathed, realizing their position. The boulder cluster that had seemed like salvation was sitting in what was essentially a drainage channel, a natural path for floodwater running off the surrounding hills. The rumble was getting louder. Mac had maybe 5 minutes before the water hit and nowhere to go. The storm was still raging, making it impossible to see potential escape routes, and leading Chester out into that maelstrom would be suicide. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it fast. Looking around desperately, Mac spotted something he'd missed before, a narrow crack between 2 of the larger boulders. maybe 3 feet wide and angling upward. Looked like it might lead to higher ground, but he couldn't see where it went in the dust and darkness. It was a gamble, but staying put was certain death. "Come on, Chester, we're going up." Mac grabbed Chester's reins and started leading him toward the crack between the rocks. The horse followed without hesitation, trusting Mac's judgment even as the roar of approaching water grew louder. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for Chester's shoulders, and it angled sharply upward, over loose rock and sand. Mac had to feel his way in the darkness, testing each step before committing his weight. Behind them, the rumble had become a roar. They were maybe 20 feet up the passage when Mac heard the water hit their former shelter. The sound was terrifying. Tons of debris-laden water smashing into rock with tremendous force. If they'd stayed where they were, they would have been swept away in seconds, but their problems weren't over. The narrow passage was becoming more treacherous with each step, and Mac could feel Chester starting to panic as the walls closed in around him. Quarter horses weren't built for rock climbing, and the loose footing was making every step a potential disaster. "Easy, boy, easy," Mac kept repeating, but his own voice was tight with fear. One wrong step would send them both tumbling back down into the flood. They climbed for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Mac feeling ahead with his hands, while Chester followed with the careful steps of an animal that knew his life depended on each placement of his hooves. The storm continued to rage above them, and the water below continued to roar. But gradually, Mac began to sense they were gaining elevation. Then, suddenly, the passage opened up. Mac emerged onto a small ledge about 40 feet above where they'd started, with Chester crowding close behind him. The space wasn't large, maybe 10 feet by 12, but it was above the flood zone and offered some protection from the wind. They'd made it. Barely, but they'd made it. Mac sank down against the rock wall, his legs shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Chester stood beside him, both of them breathing hard, listening to the fury of water and wind below them. It was going to be a long night. As the hours passed, Mac and Chester huddled together on their rocky perch, waiting for the storm to pass. Mac rationed their water carefully, giving Chester what he needed while trying to conserve enough for himself. The horse seemed to understand the gravity of their situation, standing calmly despite the chaos around them. Around midnight, the wind finally began to die down. The dust storm moved on toward the east, taking its fury with it and leaving behind a strange, profound silence. Stars appeared overhead, first a few, then thousands, brilliant in the clear desert air that followed the storm's passage. But the flood was still running below them, and Mac knew they wouldn't be able to climb down until morning at the earliest. Maybe not even then, depending on how much damage the water had done to their escape route. Mac pulled out his satellite phone, hoping against hope that it had survived the ordeal. The screen was cracked, but it still had power. 2 bars. Enough. To make a call. Double Bar Ranch. "Ellen, it's Mac." "Mac, thank God, where are you? I've been trying to reach you for hours." Mac explained their situation. Trapped on a ledge above a flash flood, both of them alive but not sure how they were going to get down. Ellen listened without interruption, and Mac could hear her moving around, probably pulling up maps and organizing. "A rescue. I'm calling search and rescue," she said. "Can you give me landmarks?" Mac looked around at the landscape revealed by starlight. "We're in that boulder field about 12 miles out on the east boundary. There's a big wash running through it now. Probably still has water in it. We're on a ledge on the north side." "Got. The rescue team will be out at first light. Can you hold on until then?" "We'll be fine," Mac said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Chester's been a trooper. I don't think we could have made it without him." After ending the call, Mac settled back against the rock wall with Chester standing guard beside him. The horse's presence was enormously comforting, a warm, living reminder that he wasn't facing this crisis alone. "Hell of a day, boy," Mac murmured, running his hand along Chester's neck. "Hell of a day." Chester nickered softly in response, a sound that seemed to say he agreed completely. As Mac dozed fitfully through the remaining hours of darkness, one thought kept running through his mind. Chester had saved his life today, not just once, but multiple times. The horse's instincts about the hidden mine shaft, his steady nerves during the climb, his calm presence through the long night, all of it had been crucial to their survival. People like to talk about horses as dumb animals, beasts of burden, without real intelligence or emotion. But Mac knew better. Chester wasn't just a horse, he was a partner, a friend, a brother in the truest sense of the word. And tomorrow, if they made it off this ledge alive, Mac was going to make sure everyone knew it. Dawn came slowly to the desert, painting the eastern sky in soft pastels that gradually revealed the scope of the previous night's devastation. From their perch on the rocky ledge, Mac could see that the flash flood had transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and hostile. What had been a dry wash 12 hours ago was now a muddy torrent 20 feet wide, carrying everything from uprooted Palo Verde trees to chunks of building material that must have been picked up miles upstream. The boulder cluster where they'd first taken shelter was completely submerged, visible only as churning white water where the current hit partially buried rocks. "We definitely picked the right time to climb," Mac told Chester, who was standing at the edge of the ledge, ears pricked toward the sound of the rushing water below. The horse looked tired but alert, and Mac was grateful that Chester seemed to have weathered the night better than he had. Mac's own condition was more concerning. His back ached from sleeping against rock, his water was nearly gone, and he was developing the kind of headache that came from dehydration and stress. More worrying was the growing stiffness in his left shoulder. He must have wrenched it during their desperate climb the night before. The satellite phone buzzed with an incoming call. "Mac, it's Ellen. How are you two holding up?" "We're alive," Mac said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Chester's doing better than I am, honestly." "What's the word on rescue?" There was a pause that Mac didn't like. "That's what I'm calling about. The search and rescue helicopter is grounded. Too much dust in the air from last night's storm. They can't get clearance to fly until this afternoon, at the earliest." Mac looked around at their situation with new eyes. The ledge that had seemed like salvation in the darkness now felt more like a trap. They had maybe 6 inches of water left between them. The sun was going to turn their rocky perch into an oven within a few hours, and the flood below showed no signs of receding. "What about ground rescue?" "They're trying, but the roads are washed out. The storm hit a huge area, Mac. We're talking about dozens of people in trouble, not just you two. Your priority because of your location, but the earliest they can get a team to you is probably tomorrow morning." Tomorrow morning. Mac looked at their water supply and did the math. In the desert heat with nothing but rock for shelter, they wouldn't last that long. "Ellen, I need you to be straight with me. What are our real chances here?" Another pause. "Honestly, if you can find a way to get more water and some shade, you'll be fine. But that ledge is going to be hell once the sun gets high." Mac ended the call and sat down heavily, his back against the rock wall. Chester immediately moved closer as if sensing Mac's discouragement. "Looks like it's just you and me, boy," Mac said quietly. "And I'm not sure I'm going to be much help." The truth was, Mac could feel his age in a way he hadn't before. 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, he might have found a way down from this ledge, might have been able to work out some kind of solution. But 58 years of hard living had taken their toll, and he was forced to acknowledge that his problem-solving abilities weren't what they used to be. Chester, on the other hand, seemed remarkably calm given their circumstances. The horse had found a small depression in the rock that offered a bit of shade, and he'd positioned himself to take advantage of what little breeze was moving across the ledge. His survival instincts were clearly better than Mac's. As the morning progressed and the temperature began to climb, Mac found himself studying Chester with new appreciation. The horse wasn't just enduring their situation. He was actively managing it, moving to find the best position as the sun tracked across the sky, conserving energy, even seeming to regulate his breathing to minimize water loss. "You're smarter than both of us," Mac told him. "Aren't you, boy?" By 10 o'clock, the sun had turned their ledge into exactly the oven Ellen had predicted. Mac had rigged his shirt into a crude shelter, but it barely helped. The rock around them radiated heat like a furnace, and the air itself seemed to burn. With each breath, Mac rationed their remaining water carefully, small sips every 30 minutes with Chester getting the larger share. The horse needed more water than Mac did, and besides, Chester was the one with the better chance of surviving this ordeal. It was around noon when Mac made a decision that would have seemed insane under normal circumstances. "Chester," he said, his voice hoarse from the dry air, "I think we need to try going down." The flood had receded somewhat, though water was still running through the wash below. More importantly, Mac had spotted what looked like a game trail on the far side of the wash, a faint line that zigzagged up the opposite slope toward higher ground, where there might be shade, maybe even some of the natural rock tanks that collected rainwater in this country. The problem was getting across 20 feet of swift-moving water with uncertain depth and a muddy bottom that could trap a horse's hooves. Under normal circumstances, Mac would never have considered it. But these weren't normal circumstances, and staying on the ledge meant certain death for both of them. "What do you think, boy? You up for a swim?" Chester moved to the edge of the ledge and looked down at the water, his ears moving back and forth as he assessed the situation. Mac had seen that look before. It was the same expression Chester got when they were working cattle, and he was figuring out the best way to cut a particular animal from the herd. The horse was thinking it through. Mac spent the next hour studying the water, looking for the safest crossing point. About 50 yards downstream, the wash made a slight bend that had created a gravel bar on the inside of the curve. The water looked shallower there, and the current less severe. If they could get down to water level, they might be able to make it across. The descent was going to be the hardest part. The passage they'd climbed in darkness was partially blocked by debris from the flood, and what remained looked treacherous in daylight. Mac wasn't sure he had the strength to make it down, much less help Chester navigate the loose rock and narrow spaces. But as the afternoon heat continued to build, the decision was made for them. Stay and die slowly, or risk everything on a desperate attempt to reach safety. Mac gathered what was left of their gear, his nearly empty water bottles, the satellite phone, his hat. Everything else would have to be left behind. "All right, Chester, this is it. Easy does it." The descent was a nightmare. What had seemed merely difficult in the dark became truly dangerous in daylight, as Mac could see exactly how precarious their position was at every step. The flood had loosened rocks that had seemed solid the night before, and several times Mac felt stones give way under his weight, sending small avalanches tumbling down ahead of them. Chester was magnificent. The horse picked his way down the treacherous slope with the careful precision of a mountain goat, testing each step before committing his weight, somehow managing to keep his balance even when the path seemed impossible. Halfway down, Mac's strength gave out. He'd been using his hands to steady himself against the rock walls, and his injured shoulder finally refused to support his weight. Mac's legs buckled, and he started to fall backward down the slope. Chester moved faster than Mac would have thought possible. The horse lunged forward, positioning his body to catch Mac's fall, taking the impact against his shoulder and neck. For a moment, they were both off balance, sliding down the loose rock, but Chester managed to brace himself and stop their descent. Mac found himself pressed against Chester's side, both of them breathing hard, inches from a fall that would have killed them both. "Easy, boy, easy," Mac whispered, though he wasn't sure which of them he was trying to calm. Chester stood rock still, letting Mac regain his balance and his grip on the rock wall. They made the rest of the descent together, Mac leaning heavily on Chester's strength, the horse somehow managing to support both their weights on the treacherous slope. When they finally reached the bottom, Mac collapsed against a boulder, his entire body shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Chester stood over him protectively, blocking the sun, his presence both a comfort and a reminder that their ordeal was far from over. The water was running faster than it had looked from above, and it was deeper too, probably 4 feet in the center, with a current strong enough to knock a man down. Mac studied the crossing point he'd identified, trying to work up the courage for what needed to come next. "You're going to have to carry me across, boy," Mac said quietly. "I don't think I can make it on my own." Chester looked at the water, then back at Mac. And Mac could have sworn he saw understanding in the horse's eyes. Not just the simple recognition of a trained animal, but genuine comprehension of their situation and what needed to be done. Mac managed to climb onto Chester's back, though the effort left him dizzy and nauseated. The horse stood patiently while Mac found his balance, then began walking toward the water's edge with careful, measured steps. The first step into the current nearly knocked them both over. The water was shockingly cold after the desert heat, and the force of the current was stronger than Mac had anticipated. Chester stumbled, caught himself, stumbled again. For a terrifying moment, Mac thought they were going to be swept downstream. Chester was fighting for every step, his hooves slipping on the muddy bottom, his powerful muscles straining against the current. Mac leaned forward over the horse's neck, trying to help with balance, whispering encouragement that was probably more for his own benefit than Chester's. Halfway across, Chester stepped into a hole. The horse disappeared up to his shoulders, and Mac was suddenly in the water himself, struggling to stay afloat in the current while trying to maintain his grip on Chester's reins. The water was murky from sediment, making it impossible to see the bottom, and Mac could feel the current trying to pull him away from Chester. But Chester never panicked. Even with water up to his neck, even fighting the current and struggling to find solid footing, the horse remained calm and focused. He fought his way out of the deep spot through sheer determination, then stood still in the shallower water, while Mac managed to pull himself back onto the horse's back. The rest of the crossing was a blur of spray and struggle, but somehow they made it. Chester hauled them both up onto the gravel bar on the far side, where they collapsed together in exhaustion. Mac lay on his back in the mud and gravel, staring up at the brilliant blue sky, unable to believe they'd survived. Beside him, Chester stood with his head down, sides heaving, water streaming from his coat. They'd made it across, but Mac knew he was in serious trouble. The crossing had taken the last of his strength, and the sun was still climbing toward its brutal afternoon peak. Without shelter and water, he wasn't going to last much longer. But Chester wasn't done saving his life. The horse began moving up the slope toward the game trail Mac had spotted from the ledge, pausing frequently to look back and encourage Mac to follow. When Mac couldn't manage more than a few steps at a time, Chester would return to his side, offering support and encouragement. It was Chester who found the cave. Mac had been focused on the game trail, assuming their only hope lay in reaching higher ground, but Chester kept angling toward what looked like just another cluster of boulders. It wasn't until they were almost on top of it that Mac realized what the horse had sensed: a natural cave formed by the way several huge rocks had fallen together, creating a space that was both shaded and cool. More importantly, there was water. A natural rock tank in the back of the cave held perhaps 50 gallons of clean rainwater, collected from the previous night's storm. Mac had never seen anything more beautiful in his life. Chester went straight to the water and began drinking with the steady rhythm of an animal that understood the importance of proper hydration. Mac managed to refill their water bottles and drink his fill, feeling strength begin to return to his body almost immediately. The cave was perfect, large enough for both of them, with good airflow and protection from the sun. Mac spread his wet shirt across some rocks to dry, then settled back against the cave wall to rest. For the first time since the dust storm had appeared on the horizon, Mac allowed himself to believe they were going to survive. Chester stood at the mouth of the cave looking out over the landscape they'd just crossed. Mac followed his gaze and marveled at what they'd accomplished. The flooded wash, the treacherous descent, the dangerous crossing. It seemed impossible that they'd made it through all of that alive. But they had, and it was entirely due to Chester's intelligence, courage, and determination. Mac had been along for the ride, but Chester had been the one making the decisions that kept them alive. "You saved us, boy," Mac said quietly. "Every step of the way, you saved us." Chester turned from his vigil and walked over to where Mac was resting, lowering his head so Mac could reach up and stroke his neck. The gesture was so gentle, so full of quiet affection, that Mac felt his eyes start to burn with tears he couldn't afford to shed. In that moment, Mac understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He'd spent months thinking. He was rescuing Chester, rehabilitating a damaged animal and giving him a second chance. But the truth was exactly the opposite. Chester had been rescuing him, not just from the storm and the flood, but from something deeper, from the slow erosion of hope that had been eating away at Mac's spirit for years. Chester had given him back a sense of purpose, a reason to trust in the possibility of renewal, a reminder that some bonds transcended explanation or expectation. Mac pulled out his satellite phone and called Ellen to report their position. Search and rescue could find them now, but it didn't matter as much. They had water, shelter, and each other. They could wait. As the afternoon heat peaked outside their cave, Mac and Chester rested in the cool darkness, both of them recovering from their ordeal. But Mac knew that when they finally made it back to the ranch, everything would be different. He'd come into the desert with a good horse. He was going home with family. The helicopter found them just before sunset, when the desert light was turning everything golden, and the heat had finally begun to ease. Mac heard the rotors long before he could see the aircraft, and Chester's ears pricked forward at the sound, alert, but not anxious, as if he understood that help was finally coming. Mac stepped out of the cave and waved his shirt at the search helicopter, marking their position. Within minutes, the crew had spotted them and was radioing for the rescue team. The pilot's voice crackled through Mac's satellite phone with news that seemed too good to be true after 36 hours of survival. "We've got you visual, Mac. Rescue team will be on the ground in 20 minutes. How are you two holding up?" "We're good," Mac replied. And for the first time since the dust storm had appeared on the horizon, he actually meant it. "Chester found us a cave with water. We're in good shape." The rescue itself was almost anticlimactic after everything they'd been through. The team rappelled down from the helicopter with professional efficiency, bringing fresh water, medical supplies, and a portable stretcher that Mac politely but firmly refused. "I can walk," he told the paramedic who was trying to convince him to let them carry him out. "Chester and I have come this far together. We're going to finish it together." The lead rescuer, a weathered man about Mac's own age named Jim Harrison, looked between Mac and Chester with the kind of understanding that came from decades of desert experience. "That's some horse you've got there," Jim said, running an appreciative eye over Chester's condition. Despite everything they'd been through, the horse looked alert and strong, ready for whatever came next. "He's the reason we're both alive," Mac said simply. The evacuation required a 2-mile hike to a clearing where the helicopter could safely land. Mac had been dreading the walk, unsure if his remaining strength would carry him that far. But Chester seemed to sense his uncertainty and positioned himself so Mac could use the horse's shoulder for support when needed. They made the journey slowly, but steadily, with the rescue team maintaining a careful watch for signs that Mac might collapse. But every time Mac felt his energy flagging, Chester would adjust his pace or his position, offering exactly the kind of support that kept Mac moving forward. "In 30 years of search and rescue," Jim told Mac as they walked, "I've never seen anything like what you two did. That crossing should have killed you both." Mac looked over at Chester, who was picking his way carefully over the rocky terrain, still alert and protective despite his own exhaustion. "Chester did most of the work," Mac said. "I just tried not to fall off." But Mac knew it was more than that. What they'd accomplished together went beyond simple survival. It was a testament to the kind of partnership that could develop between two beings who trusted each other completely. The helicopter ride back to the ranch was Mac's first time seeing the storm damage from the air. The landscape looked like it had been rearranged by a giant hand. New channels carved through familiar terrain, debris scattered for miles, entire sections of desert transformed into something alien and hostile. "Biggest storm we've seen in 20 years, the pilot told him through the headset. "You picked a hell of a time to be out there." Mac looked down at the flooded wash where they'd nearly died, at the boulder field where they'd spent that terrible night, at all the country they'd crossed on foot and horseback in their desperate bid for survival. From the air, it looked impossible, the kind of journey that should have ended in tragedy. But it hadn't, and Mac knew why. Ellen was waiting at the ranch when they landed, along with half the crew and a veterinarian who immediately began checking Chester over with professional thoroughness. Mac submitted to his own medical evaluation: dehydration, exhaustion, a wrenched shoulder, various cuts and bruises, but nothing that wouldn't heal with time and rest. "You should be in the hospital," the paramedic told him. "I should be dead," Mac replied. "I'll take what I can get." What he wanted most was to stay with Chester while the vet completed his examination. Mac had seen too many partnerships broken by well-meaning people who didn't understand the bonds that formed between horse and rider in extreme situations. But the vet, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, was clearly someone who understood horses on a deeper level. She worked quietly and efficiently, checking Chester's legs, his breathing, his overall condition, while keeping up a gentle commentary that seemed designed as much for Mac's peace of mind as for her own assessment. "Remarkable condition for what he's been through," she murmured, running her hands along Chester's legs. "No injuries, no significant dehydration. Muscle tone is excellent. This is one tough horse. He's special," Mac said, not caring how sentimental it sounded. Dr. Mitchell looked up from her examination. "I can see that. The way he keeps checking on you, that's not normal horse behavior. That's genuine concern." Mac noticed it too. Throughout the examination, Chester kept turning his head to look at Mac, as if making sure his human partner was still there and still okay. When the vet finished and stepped back, Chester immediately moved closer to Mac, resting his head against Mac's shoulder in the gesture that had become their signature of mutual comfort. "Well," Ellen said after both Mac and Chester had been cleared by their respective medical professionals, "I guess you two have got a story to tell." Over the next few hours, as the excitement of the rescue died down and the ranch settled into its evening routine, Mac found himself reluctant to leave Chester's side. The horse seemed equally reluctant to let Mac out of his sight, and Ellen eventually suggested that Mac might want to sleep in the barn that night. "Just until you're both sure this is real," she said, with understanding that came from a lifetime around horses and the people who loved them. Mac gratefully accepted the offer. He set up a cot in the tack room, close enough to Chester's stall that they could see each other, far enough away to give the horse space to rest. As the desert night settled around the ranch, Mac found himself lying in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of horses moving in their stalls, processing everything that had happened. They'd survived something that should have killed them. More than that, they'd discovered a depth of partnership that Mac hadn't known was possible. Chester wasn't just a horse he'd rehabilitated. Chester was family, in the truest and most profound sense of the word. The next few days passed, in a blur of media attention that Mac could have done without. Word of their survival had spread beyond the ranch, and reporters kept calling, wanting to interview the man and horse who survived the storm of the century. Mac politely declined most of the interviews, but he did agree to talk to a writer from a regional magazine who seemed genuinely interested in the deeper story of rehabilitation and partnership. "What would you want people to understand about what happened out there?" the writer asked. Mac thought about it for a long time before answering. "I guess I'd want them to understand that Chester didn't just save my life. He saved my faith in things I'd stopped believing in. Trust, loyalty, the possibility that broken things can be made whole again." The writer scribbled notes, then looked up. "Do you think what happened changed your relationship with Chester?" "No," Mac said immediately. "It revealed it. What happened out there didn't create the bond between us. It just showed us what was already there." The magazine story, when it came out a month later, was titled "Still Standing," a story of survival and second chances. Mac thought that captured it pretty well, though he would have emphasized the second chances part even more, because that's what Chester had given him. Not just a chance to survive a desert storm, but a chance to believe again in the possibility of renewal, of healing, of relationships that transcended explanation. 3 months after the rescue, Mac was contacted by a horse training facility in Colorado that specialized in working with problem horses, animals that had been written off by their previous owners as untrainable or dangerous. "We've been following your story," the facility director, Maria Santos, told him over the phone. "We'd like to offer you a position here. What you accomplished with Chester, that's exactly the kind of approach we need." Mac looked out the window of his small ranch. House at Chester grazing in the pasture, moving with the easy grace of a horse completely at peace with his world and his place in it. The morning sun caught the golden highlights in Chester's coat, and Mac could see the subtle scars along the horse's neck, reminders of the abuse he'd endured before arriving at the double bar. But Chester wore those scars differently now, with a dignity that spoke of healing rather than damage. "I appreciate the offer," Mac said, "but I think Chester and I are pretty happy where we are." The truth was more complex than that simple statement suggested. Mac had been 58 when the storm hit, already feeling the weight of approaching old age, wondering what purpose remained in his life. Now, at 59, he felt younger than he had in years. Chester had given him back not just his life, but his sense of meaning. The desert that had nearly killed them had also revealed the depth of their partnership. Mac had found his calling not in training horses for other people, but in the quiet daily work of caring for Chester and the small herd of rescue horses that Ellen had started bringing to the ranch. Word had spread about Mac's success with Chester, and people began arriving at the double bar with horses they'd given up on. Animals with behavioral problems, trust issues, or physical limitations that made them unsuitable for normal ranch work. At first, it was just 1 or 2 horses a month. By the end of the first year, Mac was caring for 15 rescue animals, each with their own story of abandonment or abuse. Mac took them all, one at a time, applying the lessons Chester had taught him about patience, respect, and the healing power of genuine partnership. He discovered that his age, which he'd begun to see as a limitation, was actually an asset. Younger trainers often relied on physical dominance or overwhelming energy. Mac's approach was quieter, more patient, based on observation and understanding rather than force. There was Sunny, a buckskin mare who'd been abused so badly she couldn't bear to be touched. Her previous owner had used her for illegal horse fighting, leaving her with both physical and psychological scars that seemed insurmountable. Traditional training methods had failed completely, and she'd been scheduled for euthanasia when Ellen intervened. Mac spent the first month simply sitting in Sunny's pasture, reading books or whittling, never making direct eye contact or attempting to approach her. He brought his lunch out there every day, eating quietly while the mare watched him from the far corner of the enclosure. Slowly, day by day, Sunny's curiosity began to overcome her fear. It took 6 months of sitting quietly in her pasture, never forcing contact, before she finally approached him on their own terms. The first time she touched his shoulder with her muzzle, Mac had to fight back tears. Chester, grazing nearby, had lifted his head and nickered softly, as if offering his approval of Sunny's progress. There was Blue, a paint gelding with a neurological condition that made him unpredictable and dangerous in the wrong hands. Blue's previous owners had tried to train the crazy out of him with increasingly harsh methods, until the horse became genuinely aggressive, striking and biting anyone who came near him. Mac learned to read Blue's subtle warning signs, show the way his ears would flatten just slightly before an episode, the particular tension in his neck muscles that preceded a strike. Instead of trying to suppress Blue's condition, Mac worked with it, developing a routine that gave the horse structure and predictability while accommodating his neurological challenges. Blue would never be a normal ranch horse, but under Mac's patient guidance, he became something more valuable, a teacher for other damaged horses who arrived at the ranch. Blue's calm presence had a stabilizing effect on newcomers, as if his own struggles had given him an intuitive understanding of trauma. There was Pepper, an elderly Mustang who'd never been properly gentled, and had spent years being passed from owner to owner, each one trying and failing to break his wild spirit. By the time he arrived at the double bar, Pepper was 23 years old, scarred from countless battles with humans who saw his independence as a problem to be solved, rather than a strength to be respected. Mac gave Pepper the gift of patience and discovered a horse with wisdom that came from surviving everything the world could throw at him. Instead of trying to gentle Pepper in the traditional sense, Mac simply offered him companionship and respect. The old Mustang became Mac's evening companion, the two of them walking the fence lines together as the desert sun set, neither demanding anything from the other beyond acceptance. Each horse taught Mac something new about healing, about second chances, about the possibility of redemption that existed even in the most damaged spirits. He learned that rehabilitation wasn't about erasing the past or pretending trauma hadn't happened. It was about integrating those experiences into a new understanding of strength and resilience. But Chester remained special, not just because he'd saved Mac's life in the desert, but because he'd shown Mac what was possible when two beings committed to each other without reservation. Chester had become Mac's partner in the truest sense, working alongside him with each new rescue horse that arrived at the ranch. The big gelding seemed to understand his role as a mentor and stabilizer for the other horses. When a new animal arrived, terrified and aggressive, Chester would position himself nearby, close enough to offer comfort, far enough away to avoid triggering defensive responses. He had an uncanny ability to read what each horse needed and provide it without overwhelming them. Ellen often joked that Mac had become the horse whisperer of the Sonoran Desert, but Mac knew better. He wasn't whispering to horses. He was listening to them, the way Chester had taught him to listen during those terrible hours of survival. The desert had stripped away all pretense, all the noise and distraction of normal life, and forced Mac to pay attention to what really mattered. That attention had become his greatest tool as a rehabilitator. Where other trainers saw problems to be fixed, Mac saw stories to be understood. Every head-shy horse had learned to fear human hands for a reason. Every animal that kicked or bit was protecting themselves from remembered pain. Mac's job wasn't to suppress those defensive behaviors, but to address their underlying causes. The work was slow and often frustrating. Some horses took months to show any progress, and a few never fully recovered from their trauma. But the successes were profound, and Mac found himself changed by each one. Every horse that learned to trust again taught Mac something about his own capacity for healing and growth. On quiet evenings, Mac would sit on the porch of his small house and watch Chester, moving through the pasture with the other rescue horses. The big gelding had become the leader of their small herd, not through dominance, but through the kind of quiet authority that came from confidence and experience. Chester's leadership style reminded Mac of the best ranch foreman he'd known. Firm, when necessary, but always fair. Always focused on the welfare of the group, rather than personal dominance. Young horses looked to Chester for guidance, and he provided it with patience and wisdom that seemed remarkable in an animal who had once been written off as worthless. Chester would often approach the fence where Mac sat, resting his head over the top rail in the gesture that had become their private greeting. Mac would stroke the horse's neck and remember those hours in the desert when they depended on each other for everything. Warmth, courage, hope, the will to keep moving when stopping meant death. "You know what you did, don't you, boy?" Mac would murmur. "You didn't just save my life, you saved my soul." Chester would exhale softly, a sound that seemed to say he understood completely. In those moments, Mac felt the same profound connection that had sustained them through their ordeal in the desert, a bond that transcended words or explanation, rooted in absolute trust and mutual respect. The magazine story about their survival had ended with a photograph of Mac and Chester standing together in the ranch yard, both of them looking directly at the camera with expressions of quiet confidence. The caption read, "Still standing. Mac Thompson and Chester, 3 months after surviving 36 hours in the Sonoran Desert." But Mac knew the real story wasn't about survival. It was about transformation. Two broken spirits had found each other and discovered that healing was possible, that trust could be rebuilt, that second chances were real if you were brave enough to believe in them. The photographer had captured something essential in that image. Not just two survivors, but two beings who had found their purpose in healing others. Mac kept a copy of the photograph on his kitchen table, and visitors often commented on the obvious bond between man and horse visible in the picture. "You can see it in their eyes," one visitor had said. "They're looking at the camera, but they're really looking out for each other." That was exactly right, Mac thought. 3 years after their desert ordeal, he and Chester were still looking out for each other, still partners in everything they did. Their relationship had deepened rather than faded with time, growing stronger as they worked together to help other damaged horses find their way back to trust and hope. The desert had tested them and found them worthy, not just of survival, but of the kind of partnership that transcended species, circumstance, and expectation. They had been through hell together and emerged not just intact, but transformed, better than they had been before, stronger for having faced their fears and limitations together. Years later, when people asked Mac about that time in the desert, he would always say the same thing. "Chester saved my life, but more than that, he taught me how to live again." And Chester, grazing peacefully in the desert pasture that had become his kingdom, seemed to understand that he had found his true calling not as a ranch horse or a show animal, but as a teacher of the most important lesson of all, that love, loyalty, and trust could flourish even in the harshest places if you were willing to fight for them. The ranch had become something neither Mac nor Ellen had originally envisioned, a sanctuary not just for damaged horses, but for the kind of healing that happened when broken spirits found each other and chose to rebuild together. Mac's small house overlooked pastures filled with horses that had once been written off as hopeless, all of them now living proof that redemption was possible. In the end, that was what people remembered about the story of Mac and Chester. Not the dramatic rescue or the media attention, but the quiet truth that some bonds are strong enough to survive anything, even being left for dead in the desert. They were still standing, still together, still teaching everyone around them that broken doesn't mean worthless, that damage doesn't mean beyond repair, and that sometimes the most profound healing happens not in spite of our scars, but because of them. The desert wind would blow across the ranch in the evenings, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of storms. But Mac no longer feared the weather. He had learned from Chester that survival wasn't about avoiding the storm. It was about finding someone worth weathering it with. And as the sun set over the Sonoran Desert, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Mac and Chester would stand together at the pasture fence, two survivors who had found in each other exactly what they needed to not just endure, but to thrive. The desert had left its mark on both of them, but they were still standing, together, unbroken, home. Thanks for spending time with us today. If this story meant something to you, pass it on. This is Still Standing Souls, real stories, quiet strength, lasting hope.